I asked her straight up, like, is your sleep schedule still as fucked as it was when we were in grade school? And she was like, yes. And I'm like, sweet, we're gonna play Fall Guys for the next 90 minutes.
Perfect. What's up? Welcome to Deep in the D-Pad. You know the drill. RK Taylor here with Carlos Gutierrez.
Hello, friendly neighborhood game designer and host. Not for this episode, though. I'm just like co-host.
You sound like a ghost or something. You sound like, ooh, you know, there's like that undulating vibe.
Yeah. I'm throwing the whammy bar on my intro for this one.
Whoa. Ooh, guitar here. Okay. Also, regular guitars, too? I don't know.
Regular guitars have whammy bars, yeah.
Okay. I don't know how electric guitars work. So, good thing we're not talking about that today.
Dude.
Yeah, good thing we're talking about game engines today. Unity, Unreal, what happened before these game engines? Are there any other emergent game engines that we should talk about? And also, how do engines work in general? What does that term even mean? Carlos is going to give us the good information today. But first, we have our D-Pad delights. Carlos, you want to go first? You want to tell us about any game engine stuff that you're currently working on, or just your game side projects or anything like that?
So I had this one fun project that I worked on with a few friends. It was a virtual reality project that we kind of roughly call Little Man or something like that. And Little Man is this kind of Katamari-inspired game. I don't really remember how we pulled in where we pulled in the other inspirations from, but the idea was, hey, we like it when we start small and grow really big over the course of a level. So we then asked ourselves, like, what kind of feels good in VR? And like moving your arms around feels good. Like some of the low level stuff is like eating something in VR is very VR, like flat screen games. You eat things all the time and it feels no different, but eating something in VR like feels cool because you're putting it to your mouth and it disappears and makes a sound. But we decided to kind of take that idea of Katamari plus eating, which I guess is kind of like Pac-Man-esque.
I was thinking more like Snake or Centipede, where it gets
Snake, yeah. That's a better one, yeah. So in that, with the good reference Snake, like you have a full-size level and you're kind of like this, I just call him a wizard for now. There's literally like no art in here, but you're like kind of a wizard character or a warlock, and you have a little imp that you can control using the thumbsticks on the motion controllers. And you can control his arms and the imp, his arms and his grabbing just by moving your arms and grabbing. And then what your goal is now is to control the imp and make the imp eat as much as he can. And you see him getting bigger and bigger as he eats until he becomes like kind of like a little King Kong. And the last objective is for him to eat you. That's kind of like our big like, whoa, shit moment. And if you're not cool with motion sickness, you're going to fucking hate that moment. But it is a very surreal, like, Attack on Titan type moment, especially because you are the one dictating the action. Like, you know, oh, I'm holding my hand up and I'm holding myself in my hand up, which sounds like really trippy, and it's like visually pretty trippy and cool. But that is what we have so far. It's just a demo level where you run around and you eat shit until you eat yourself. And
that reminds me of
my side project.
The Grover Saves the Universe.
Trover.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. What you were saying about like basically controlling a thing that is acting on itself, right? Mm-hmm. That's like how like Trover has that level of abstraction, right?
Yes, but I think what I'm more so talking about is like the thing I'm controlling is now somehow controlling me. Where as far as I know in Trover it doesn't do that. Like they talk to you and you could nod, but they never like start controlling your chair or anything.
I see.
So in this case it would be like if Trover grew big and then grabbed your chair, like, but you're using your arm to control Trover's arm. So you as Trover, but seeing from your own Cherorpian self, grab yourself and lift yourself up and like look at yourself as if Trover's looking at a snow globe. It's really weird. But anyway, that's Little Man. Tell me about your side project.
Wait, is that Unreal? Did you use Unreal for that?
Oh, yeah, that's an Unreal. Yeah, we're using like Unreal 4 point whatever is like recent. It has like some built-in virtual reality stuff, but like any game engine, you gotta build a lot around it to support what you want to do. So yeah, we've been kind of nursing that for quite some time. So
has this been released, or when you say nursing it, do you mean you're still working on it like in chunks?
No, like the project itself is not necessarily one game. We're just we're kind of exploring different technical paths and stuff as we like try out different ideas.
Okay.
So there's actually like 3 ideas or 3 semi-playable ideas within that project file, you know, because it's a whole series of like folders and shit.
That's cool.
But we don't have it as just one game because we want it to be more of that sandbox that lets us like express whatever we want, but quickly and in a way that other people could pick it up and be like, oh shit, I get this, which like that takes a long time. And that's why I say we're nursing it, because like it's not the game, like the games are being nursed, but the tech, I guess the tech stack is what we call it, underneath all that is being nursed by like the engineer and or engineers on the project. And this is all just in our free time. We're not like breaking our backs for it or anything. I mean, we are when we really want to. Like when, oh, little man needs to eat, but this bug is happening, like I want to fix that bug. But outside of that, this is just stuff that is purely like, man, I really wish I could be doing this, and then just saying, well then let's fucking do it, but like on our own terms.
Yeah, I can piggyback off that actually in regards to my own side project. I've talked to you a little bit about it, but for 4 months in 2021, you know, like as the pandemic was kind of like phasing out, I downloaded Unity and I started to develop this game that I'm calling Mama's Bot. Right. And it's super early stages still, but you know, you were saying that you were kind of like creating the game that you were inspired to make because you wanted to play it, and you can't really do that yet. I mean, with VR especially, there's so much ground that has yet to be tread. There's so much exploration to do, and like really defining what the genre itself is or the medium itself is. But what I wanted was a like platforming roguelike that wasn't an action game at all, you know, doesn't have any combat. And so that's the direction I'm going. I don't know any games right now that are currently doing that. And I like roguelikes, I like platformers. I don't always want to be bopping something on the head, you know, sometimes I just want to be jumping around or like using a lasso or something like that. So yeah, that's kind of, and I've learned so much already just from, you know, watching YouTube videos. There's so many resources out there. Unity is very complex, and, you know, I just know that I'm at the tip of the iceberg. But one thing I've really enjoyed about it so far is that you know, I've learned some programming. I've done some visual art. You know, I got different graph paper, and I want the art style to be very like geometric and stuff. And I've done some of the like animating, you know, taking the different, the stills and, you know, having them execute a specific, you know, combination of those, like almost flipbook, like, you know,
yeah,
depending on the button inputs. And now I'm on the music phase, and I've like my project has totally derailed because I'm just like obsessed with, you know, like music theory at this, like for this month right now, you know, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like for you, because you're covering all these different bases, and because, you know, you're early on into it, you're learning a lot of new stuff, and it's gonna take you a while longer if you keep going at this pace. Do you feel okay with that? Do you think that might hurt your morale if it goes on a little too long as you're learning these things?
Yeah, I thought that I would be able to create the game much more quickly than I now understand. Like I was originally thinking like, oh, this would probably take like a year max. And now seeing all the different parts and knowing that I'm trying to like do this entire thing on my own, I know that this would be a years long project, like no doubt about that.
Yeah. And
I also, you know, because I'm like stepping outside it for a minute and you know, playing music instead, and learning about like how music works really, I still feel happy and motivated to pursue and to like, you know, learn and be creative at, you know, like not simultaneously, but like in tandem, I guess, you know, or like it's like switching back and forth between learning, and then trying something. So as long as I don't like have like rigid deadlines or timelines, and, you know, also the fact that it's not, there's no like financial dependency on this whatsoever. I'm able to do this as a hobbyist. I don't really feel that pressure. You know, I think it's like in my work with like the clients that I work with, one thing that I was taught in some training, which, you know, most of these trainings are such an eye roll, but I thought this was such a good takeaway. You know, I work with young adults who are coming out of foster care, so they are often they haven't had a lot of support, and my job is to provide them some of that support. And that could be like going to the DMV and getting their permit, for example. And I can encourage them to take practice tests, or I can do that with them or something like that, right? And this is just one really tiny example. But the idea from the training is to be task oriented rather than goal oriented. And essentially what that means is like, don't expect the outcome. Don't wait for the reward. If your goal is to get this person a permit, they may have failed the test like 5 times, and like you have to be okay with that. You have to be resilient to that. So knowing that you have done your job by enabling this person to even take the test, that may have been an opportunity that they didn't have otherwise. So it's a way of feeling like compassion satisfaction rather than compassion fatigue, right? And I find that is similar with creative work. When you're creating a game, as long as you're enjoying the process of creating the game, and you're following a passion that you have, and you're not financially dependent on it. This is specifically for hobbies, I guess. It's much harder when your food is dependent on your ability to create.
Right,
but
yeah. If you're like an indie creator trying to get your next game or your next update out, yeah, it's way more stressful.
And now let's get deeper into the D-pad. Okay. Enough of this. Let's just break down what a game engine is. Please just work with me like I am a kindergartner, okay? If someone knew nothing about technology, right? What is the function of a game engine, I guess, like in the most basic sense, a criteria that would cover all things that we would refer to as game engines. So without using any specific game engine as an example, ideally.
For someone who knows little to nothing about technology.
Let's assume they've played a game. They understand what a game is.
All right, that's a fair step easier. Let's say they played the original Mario or whatever.
Yeah.
So the game engine is kind of the like backbone of it's the technical backbone of the game. If we look at it in a more, say, automotive or vehicle sense, the game is a car or a train. It's your vehicle that you transport across some sort of platform. And the engine is your roadway or your rail system. So your game is your car, your engine is your road, your game is your train, your engine is your rails. The engine is what allows the engine makes the tracks that allows your game to like properly run and function the way it's supposed to. A car without a road could operate, but it's probably going to be bumpy and uncomfortable. A train without rails, I don't think works at all. I think they just immediately fall over like a fucking cow tipping or something. But
so the game engine is the infrastructure, and basically the game itself, like the software the application that you're running, how is it able to switch between different tracks? You know what I mean? Like.
So what do you mean by switching tracks? Do you mean like changing the engine while the game is in progress?
I'm having trouble with the vehicle metaphor because game engine is like like an already a part in a car at one.
Yeah.
So it's like, really, can we do it without a metaphor? Like I understand that it's enabling, it sounds like it's enabling the like game to be played.
Yes.
Right, but is it an operating system? Like, is it software?
Okay, to kind of step away from that car train metaphor, you kind of called it on the money. The engine is the infrastructure. The game is whatever uses that infrastructure. So from a physical standpoint, it is software. It is something you're going to download. In the old days, it was probably stuff you installed via multiple floppy disks or CDs,
Right, I can't touch a game engine the way I could touch a car engine.
Exactly, yes. And so what the game engine typically looks like is like the Matrix code. It's just all like C# or what have you, not C#, C++ or what have you, that is like just all in different components in this master hierarchy of shit that you like in some cases can't even touch because like you don't have admin permissions or something to touch it. So what does this look like? Well, typically, for any developer who has, say, Unity or Unreal, it's going to be a like shortcut icon on your desktop. You're going to double click it, wait a little bit, a window pops up that says Unreal Engine, and then boom, like, or Unity, and then the whole window opens up, and you have this kind of like blank level in front of you. Maybe it's blue, maybe it's grayish with like clouds in the sky, but you'll have like just this blank thing in front of you in some cases. In other cases, they'll have like a template map or something that's loaded with a character in there, so you could just be like, oh cool, maybe I could play this, and lo and behold, you can. And from there you could like click the different actors in the scene, and there's many detail focused windows around this kind of main editor thing. So if I had to visually break it down for you, you open up the editor, you see a big window, you know, let's say you were opening Microsoft Word or any like browser tab, right? You got this one big window covering your screen, and now it's segmented into like 5 or 6 different rectangular widgets. One of these widgets lets you see into the game world. Another one of these widgets lets you see all the game files you have. A third widget lets you see all the details of any game object you click in the world. Another widget may tell you what levels you have in the world and or what those levels contain. And that helps you kind of organize your files and make sure shit doesn't get out of hand where you have like pickups living in the same level as like your hard-coded scripting for like action to happen and things
Right.
like that.
There are also layers. There's, you know, you can see what's in the foreground, what's in the background, and like what's in the midground, and you can create those layers. Which is similar to how the visual Adobe programs work, like Photoshop. They also have like, you know, an inspector / hierarchy type thing. So there are a lot of similar. If you've ever like looked at both of like these side by side, there are a lot of similarities. Also things like GarageBand, or you know, like they're like DAWs, I think, Digital Audio Workstation, I think is the acronym that's used. They have similar, you know, except they're layering with different tracks, you know, but being able to have exclusive control over these things, make these things visible or, you know, invisible or inaudible, you know, it's essentially the same function. It's just interfacing with a different sense.
Yeah. And we often see like kind of short screenshots of these things in those, like, to tie it into an earlier episode with the games hype machine or games journalism. Oftentimes when we see these commercials that are like, yeah, you know, we're the developers, or like, I'm Mr. Executive and I'm very in tune with the developers, as they're talking in a suit in front of people who have been like crunching for 70 hours that week. And, you know, then you see their editors on screen in the background. Sometimes they're blurred to not show, you know, what game is in development. But if you have seen any of those types of videos, then you have kind of seen what one of these game editors looks like. And even if you haven't seen the editor itself, yes, a lot of the programs around it kind of look similar. They definitely don't have a core function that is like similar, but they have all these different widgets and accoutrements that like just work well. So it becomes almost like standard practice across like some type of software spectrum, which seems to be the whole widgets and layering and stuff seems to be kind of like ubiquitous across creative applications. Like I wouldn't necessarily see that in Excel.
We found a very efficient way of like manipulating the data, like data across media. One thing that blows my mind about game engines specifically, in contrast to these other digital audio workstations and like the Adobe programs, is that the game engine itself is like a bunch of code, like you said. It's like just like a ton of C#, right? But it's presenting you with this UI that enables you to code. So like there's just like a level. It's like we have found the easiest way to write code and manipulate this, and then give that to developers so that they already have a bunch of tools. You know, they still have to learn how to code and develop and do all these design and all of that, but without the game engine, you know, or imagine creating a game engine from scratch. You know, you have a lot of tools at your disposal because they already came packaged. There's been a lot of trial and error. People have realized how to make this more efficient. And I guess that makes me wonder what game engines like looked like in the past, but I guess let's hold off on that. I'm curious about like the UI of them and stuff, but before we do that, I want to touch on like consoles really quick because I was thinking about the infrastructure conversation that we were having, and it would seem to me that the like N64 would be the infrastructure, the physical machine, and the train on the rails would be the cartridge that you would be like literally putting in, and like it would be connecting with a different medium.
In the physical sense, that definitely connects. Yeah.
Right. So why is it? I mean, it is the case that if you have like let's say an N64 game and a PS1 game, right? They could be made in the same engine, but they're not able to be played on the same console. So where does the console fit in, to the whole game engine conversation?
So that's kind of like towards the end step, I suppose. I can't really speak for how it was handled like decades ago, but I can tell you more or less how I understand it works now, which like if you have Unity or Unreal, you have your game set up as a game, and they have magic code in them that basically allows you to build out the executable, the .exe file that you double click to run the game. It builds it out in whatever special way, coding wise, it builds it out for like the PlayStation platform versus the Microsoft platform, say versus the Nintendo Switch platform, because they have some sort of differences in those console software architectures. I think I am now really close to talking straight out of my ass, but I believe that's kind of how it works. It's like the PlayStation software that's already in there, the PlayStation operating system, like the data that needs to be pressed to disk for that type of operating system is slightly different than the data that is needed to run on an Xbox.
And that's because there's hardware differences, right? Like the software is tailored to the specific, let's say, graphics card, which would be like a piece of hardware. Is that correct?
So the consoles themselves are built with, in some cases, very similar components, and within those components has to be software, some sort of operating system or software architecture that utilizes those components to, say, their fullest potential. And to make that happen, there are, I guess, like some sort of like coding differences within, say, a PlayStation and an Xbox and a Switch and what else have you. Actually, this could also be, I imagine there is also something about like in PCs themselves, because like I hear problems, or rather I read problems on the internet of like, oh, this certain like graphics card is not working for the game, and it's like a modern graphics card, and the devs will say, oh, we actually like, we haven't like worked in support for that framework yet. So I think that problem, but for consoles, is why when you launch Unreal and you're like wanting to play a build of your game, it gives you the options to export it to, say, a Microsoft framework, a Sony framework, a mobile framework, because seems like most phones just have the same platform type architecture, and say like the Nintendo one. It gives it just special code so that it can inject itself to the operating system of that console, I believe.
Okay, cool. That is helpful. Okay, can we get to the history?
Yeah, let's jump into some history.
So is it the case that every game was Pong created using a game engine?
Yeah, so I think so, and we'll go even earlier than Pong, because Pong, you're talking about like
okay,
Pong
backgammon it is,
and there was. Yeah, so it was actually called Tennis for Two, and it wasn't built on a game engine per se. It was Tennis for Two. It was built on either a kernel or some type of display hardware. Like, basically, it's like, what if, 1960s IBM Watson, which is probably the size of like a letterbox, what if that had a little like submarine radar screen on it and you could play Pong? Like, that's literally what it was.
Yeah,
like,
I've seen the pictures
was like,
before.
I'm gonna hack this mainframe and fucking make Pong, bro. Like, oh my god, that's so funny. Excuse me. So that's kind of like where things started out. Like, that's not the definitive start. I'm not sure, but Tennis for Two was like a real big moment for like early games, and that later on down the road, more things were being built on, say, display hardware, which means kind of like the consoles or the arcade cabinet. Like, it's specifically like this machine only runs Streets of Rage and nothing else. And like Pac-Man for Atari 2600 is only built for 2600. Like it's built from the ground up for the 2600, which is why back in the day, quote unquote, when we were playing games like Spider-Man 1, the movie, the game, you would have a different game for the GameCube version, the Xbox version, and the PS2 version. Like, that's not that long ago, and we were still having that.
A completely different game? Because they would have to code it from the ground up each time? They couldn't just transfer? Is that what you're saying?
They were able... I don't know how bad it was back then, but they were able to keep some level of parity between the games. But there were stark differences. Not like one game, outside of the visual fidelity. And it wasn't necessarily like, oh, this game looks like horrible trash, and this game looks like, amazing. It was more so like, and just taking the Spider-Man game specifically, it's like, why am I missing a whole Kraven the Hunter chapter? Why am I missing a whole Venom chapter? And it's like, oh, the GameCube disc literally didn't have the space to put that level or two in the game. So it's on the Xbox version and the PlayStation version. In some cases, it
those
might be
mini
like a
CDs.
feature. Yeah, man. Screw those mini CDs.
Oh, that's wrong. I did not know that.
But that was rough.
It's like this is supposed to be a home console, like a home gaming console. This is not like some PSP shit.
Yeah, and I mean, that's funny you mentioned that, because the PSP, I think, was one of the strongest. If I recall, it was like one of the strongest handhelds, and then maybe the Vita right after that. But I feel like we're detouring, or rather getting distracted a little bit. So, focusing it back on the history of things, like we talked about the Tennis for Two, we talked about kind of like when engines weren't even really a thing, everything was just coded from the ground up. And the coded from the ground up thing is not the Spider-Man thing. I think that's like, things progressed a lot to that point. That's more so the Atari 2600, like, let's make Pac-Man for Atari. We got to build it from the ground up for Atari, but we also got to build it from the ground up for this other console, and this, that, and the third. And that is like tremendously difficult for any developer to do. But moving forward from that, we kind of get into the, I guess, NES, SNES era, where like they're still building things from the ground up, but I think we start to see a bit of templatization, if that's the word, like prefabrication, like basically these 2D construction kits. RPG Maker is a modern day example of one that's actually been around since like the 80s. RPG Maker or something like that, which RPG Maker I think is a variant of Game Maker, which is a 2D game engine specifically for 2D games on PC. There's also Click and Play, which came out in the 80s and I think has gotten multiple iterations. And I mean, the most recent example that's probably hit it big is none other than Super Mario Maker. You just have a tablet, click, clack, click, clack, click, and you play. It's literally click and play with like all the sound effects of like the bricks coming together and you testing out your stuff. So like back in Mario 1, Miyamoto had to use literal graph paper to map out like his levels, and I don't exactly know how that translated into like the engine itself. Maybe it's something similar to how Mario Maker works, and that's why they had to do it on graph paper. But we've progressed so far since then. I am very happy for it, because making games was tough.
It makes sense that they would use graph paper. I mean, one of the first features that I learned when I was beginning with Unity was how to like enable a grid system, because you just need to know how like the size of things, the distance between areas, and like distance is extremely important for any visual medium.
Where
right?
things sit is vitally important to like so many things in the game. Yeah,
says the level
location. Yes, location matters. Location. That's what realtors say.
yeah. You're like the overzealous professor who's like chucking their opinions at the students, and they like just take it as gospel. You're like, level's the most important possible component of a game, and there's just like some lighting engineer who's like crying right now.
Oh, I mean, no. Well, yes, of course. Of course someone will feel strongly about something, but I definitely take lighting as a big consideration.
So you took us from Tennis for Two, which came out in the late 50s, and through the 90s. When did Unreal and Unity pop up? I think that most people who game in general must have they must see these logos, right? They're at the beginning of almost every video game. They're completely ubiquitous, and people have probably never paid attention to them. I'm sure that there are some people who like have no idea what that even refers to. You know, I don't think I would have even 5 years ago or something. So how did Unity and Unreal become so big, and are they like the duopoly right now? I mean, is there anything that could possibly threaten their duopoly, or is it just that they really perfected game engines to a point where there doesn't need to be any third?
Nah, nobody has done that yet, but you've got a good slew of questions, so I'll try to tackle them in order. So you asked, like, when did Unreal and Unity like start becoming a thing? And or like, why did they become a thing? The why is because it made shit easy. It templatized as best as it could, making a type or multiple types of video games. Rather than having to build something from the ground up every single time, the entire workforce was like, why the fuck are we rebuilding this shit every single time? Like, a phrase we hear often in my field is, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't reinvent the wheel. Because I think, this was literally them every single time reinventing the wheel up until 1998 when Unreal Engine 1 is released. May 22nd, 1998 is when the Unreal Engine comes out, and it comes out with Unreal Tournament, the first Unreal Tournament, a first-person shooter. It's got like multiplayer, I think, online connectivity, and then has this like, here's this, sandbox for you to make your own shooter type of Unreal game and fuck with it and like make custom maps, do scripting, do this, and like have it playable for other people that have Unreal Engine. That's how it started.
You got me busting out the whiteboard. I'm hype. Really quick before we get to the other questions, if we can even remember them, I just want to tack on that it's not just that you don't want to reinvent the wheel because that's a waste of time, although that is huge. I mean, that's that's the biggest resource, right?
Right.
It's also that you can, if things are already prefabricated, you can then do more complex, you can create more complex mechanics, right? Yes. So if you already have the structure for a skill tree, and then you can implement different skill trees in different parts of the game, and you have the basic technology already worked out. You're just kind of changing the variables.
And much like the things we identified with like Photoshop and the other creative programs, like the layering and the different widgets, we end up seeing that appear through the growth of Unreal and Unity. And where we get to see the complexity of games increase is through the kind of common usage of certain mechanics or tools within many games. So as the Unreal Engine and Unity get updated, they are reaching out to the creators, to the community of developers, and saying, hey, like, what do you need? How can we better serve you? Because they're trying to create a symbiotic relationship. They want to make a really good platform so people can make really good games, so that people will go and buy their engine specifically to make better and better games, and say, hey, I want to make open world games. The market needs open world games. Unity, give us open world capabilities. Unreal, give us open world capabilities. If Unreal says I can't, then the market's going to go to Unity. If now it is like, oh, Call of Duty's the biggest shit on the block, and Unity can't really do first-person shooters well, then it looks like Unreal is going to have quite a good amount of business for the next little while. Same goes with kind of like the graphical fidelity updates and stuff like that. Like Unreal, as far as I know, has like always been leading the charge in like high fidelity graphics when it comes to game engines, whereas Unity is in many ways far more approachable. And if anything, like, using Unity helps you learn more about game engines than, say, Unreal, because Unreal has a lot of things that's kind of like tucked away in the background for the sake of streamlining whatever you specifically are working on. Just to kind of wrap up that thought, these game engines got updated with more widgets, like the layers tool, like the let me see all my object, the world outliner is what it's called. Let me see all my objects in this level tool, the viewport with different camera angles, right? You mentioned you could see things like a grid. You could see things, they added in the ability to like change your camera perspective from like full 3D to like maybe tilt shifted to top down to like from the left, from the right. They even gave you the ability to look at the game world through multiple windows. So if you wanted, you could have like a cool like 2x2 grid of like just different angles looking at this one thing. And it's come to this point where we can now make supremely big and complex games with these engines that can pump out movie-esque titles.
The engine is obviously a great utility, right? It allows things to become systematic and easily classifiable, and it's like imagine having a word processor, like a typewriter, old school typewriter, and then getting Microsoft Word and knowing that you have cut and paste. That's an amazing feat, and you never want to go without copy and paste ever again. Yeah. You don't want to go back to using a typewriter unless you're a hipster. But there's still something about it that feels like dirty to me about the game engine for some reason, and I don't want games to have to be coded from bottom to top, but it seems like it's serving some kind of market, and there's people are getting their hands greased. It reminds me of like factory farming, where everything has become so systematized, right? Like I feel like the game engine is almost like the electronic cow milker, like it just attaches to an udder so that we can produce as much milk as possible because the demand of milk is so high. And there's something about that feels like less pure. But I again, like why reinvent the wheel, right? Like I'm encouraging that feeling that I'm having is like encouraging a less efficient system or something. And I don't stand by it, but it seems curious, and I'm curious about the way it's arising in me. Wow.
There's definitely a lot of I scratch your back, you scratch my back type of thing going on, I guess, because that symbiotic quote unquote relationship needs to be made. Like it takes so long for a development house to make a custom engine. It takes so long, as well as it takes time, money, and hundreds of people, if not more. And with those hundreds of people, it still takes like years. That's why in a lot of cases, like building an engine from scratch is extremely like costly and risky, and like I don't know what gets you greenlit for creating a whole new engine to start doing things, besides maybe the prospect of we can stop paying Unreal and Unity and just use our engine across all of our studios. That's the only thing I can see being that like long run justification. But doing that, creating the engine itself, like you basically can't have anyone making games. Because if you're now making an engine from scratch, you're only going to want to employ engineers for however long you need them to build the base. And that is not to say that you shouldn't have artists and designers, because if anything, now they all have to get into the mix of the conversation, because they are thinking of like, what's everything I could have ever wanted from a game engine, and what's all the shit I wish every game engine I've used could have avoided. And that's like really hard for people to rack their brains on. But that is what happens at like the base level. Like there's no game making happening. And then it's like maybe 4 years in when they're finally like, oh, well, now we have a viewport that lets you see the game world. And now we have a window that lets you click on all this shit, because they're having to build that themselves. In some cases, or in a lot of cases rather, like I guess with bigger games, they buy or license a version of Unreal or Unity, and then they build on top of that. Like they have the right to build on top of that and make it into a engine that's way more customized to their studio and what their studio is hoping to achieve.
Yeah, it's like if we thought about like a company that employed painters, right? And then what they decided is that all of a sudden, instead of making paintings, they're just going to try to create every color by hand by appropriately mixing all of these different paints together. All of their efforts would have to go into creating new colors of paint, right?
Exactly.
Rather than like painting pictures. And they would have to believe that investment was that was going to be, there was going to be a financial payoff or some other kind of payoff in creating all of these paints. Perhaps they could sell their paints to other people.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like, I guess, taking either the palette of colors and like fucking tacking on your own extra like side palette for additional colors, or this metaphor is going to get really weird, but so I'll just end it here. You could potentially, if the palette that you're taking paint off of is your engine, you could potentially like break a piece off in a way, move it around and attach it to another side that's actually like more helpful or something. Rather than like reducing from it, you're starting with a common place because nobody wants to make all that like low level shit again and again. And from there, you're like, oh, well, we really want to do cinematics, like knock it out the park. Okay, well, now we're going to like type in extra code for our cinematics. We're going to type in code so that like there's no loading screen when Kratos finishes a fight and then a cinematic starts. And we're going to have to code that in. We're going to have to code in both the ability to like seamlessly transition, as well as the ability to not need a loading screen, as well as the ability, to have these characters. In some cases, these characters are like instantly being, they're being swapped in. Like their player character and their cinematic character are not the same. So maybe you need code to magically swap these people in without, revealing the swap is happening, even if they're on screen at that very instant. That's the real magic, the real smoke and mirrors shit that the technomancers do.
For a skill tree today, I wanted to talk about narrative specifically, something that we could relate to in video games, but also that transcends across other media of art. In the history of ideas, there's like a lineage of people who have influenced other people, right? And we can look at this as like a web, because some people were influenced by multiple people, and those people go on to influence other people, almost like a food web. Is kind of how I'm picturing it. The hero's journey, I think, kind of starts with Carl Jung, who was a psychologist who wrote a lot about archetypes.
Yeah, you brought him up when we talked about Control. Yeah.
Oh, dope. Okay, cool. Yeah, there's a lot of Jungian stuff that's like in Control, and like the things that you collect and read, and there's a lot of like lore that's based on his work. But this book that I'm holding up is by Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was influenced by Jung, and he was a folklorist. So basically, he just studied storytelling across different cultures and different time periods, and he found commonalities between them. Right, that was kind of like his whole shtick. He and George Lucas were like intellectual bros, because the hero's journey, Star Wars was based on a hero's journey.
Right.
Joseph Campbell, I think he was kind of a celebrity in his day. I guess I should talk about what the hero's journey is, right? That's the whole point of this. That's what the skill tree is about. The hero's journey is a path, right? I learned about the hero's journey from the perspective of writing fiction, right? And I studied a guy called Christopher Vogler, who took the ideas of Campbell, who took the ideas of Jung, right? And so across a century, that people are writing and reacting to different ideas. But the idea of the hero's journey, and it comes from the archetype of a hero, right? The original Jungian archetype,
right?
It takes a character who through the process of transformation, and like literally any protagonist of anything, right? Right. Except things that are like postmodern, right? This is something that sets postmodern work apart, is that there isn't necessarily some kind of triumph or some kind of transformation, and that can reflect the bleakness of a world. But for prior to the postmodern era, and I think still in most video games, there is some kind of quest that a person is going on. For more literary work, that's usually more of an internal quest, and for genre, like what is classified as genre fiction, like sci-fi or fantasy, that's an actual quest, like an external quest. So getting the ring, in Lord of the Rings, or defeating Voldemort in Harry Potter, those are very external, conquerable goals, rather than something that's like about like a transformation, like how can I deal with the grief of losing my husband, is an internal, more kind of like literary, more psychological approach. But the hero's journey, because video games require interactivity with the world, their journey is similar to the genre fiction type of approach, right? So usually there's a task, you have to collect things, you have to get to some finish line or something like that, right?
Right, like Luke needs to meet a dude, get a lightsaber, learn a trick, and then he could beat the bad guy. That's kind of like his journey, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so there are different like there are graphs that depict like the 12 steps of the hero's journey. And we're not going to run through all of them, but you know, it's like basically it's like there are sub conflicts, right? It's like, oh, like at some point, you know, the like one of the first ones, for example, is the ordinary world, and then there's the call to adventure. So something happens in the typical world that now motivates the you know, impetus for the rest of the story. Without that event, there would be no story because things would have continued to be ordinary.
Right. Bowser shows up, steals a princess or a fairy, and Mario's like, oh, fuck that, and has to chase after.
Absolutely. Usually in like, I don't know how often this is true in video games, and it would be interesting if you could think of any examples, but the next step would be the refusal to call. Okay? So normally, you know, this is you're a wizard, Harry, and he's like, no, I can't be a wizard. That's ridiculous, you know? And then it's like, right. Oh, well, he's on his path, you know? So the idea of conflict, there has to be some kind of conflict. The person cannot just readily accept the responsibility because that person kind of already is a hero. There has to be some resistance. Often they're guided by a mentor, which is the fourth step, right? So that's the Merlin type character. There's someone who has the knowledge, the know-how, who is not personally capable of completing it, right? So if it was a sports movie, this could be a coach. They're not athletic enough to do this, but they have...
maybe that's... is that like Hattie, the hat character from the newest Mario game?
I was thinking like Toad is often the mentor, because for the player... Okay. See, it's interesting because you are controlling the player, and you're controlling the character in a video game, but they also have to feed you information. Like, they're not necessarily feeding Mario the information of press A, but they're acting like it because it's coming out in dialogue. So it probably changes across the Mario franchise, but like when I think of Mario 64, like Toad was like there for tips. You could like walk up to Toad and ask Toad a question or something like that.
True, Toad was all over the place, and they somehow knew exactly like what was going on, but they just couldn't do it themselves. Like, oh, dude's at the top of Bob-on Mountain. I'm too small to pick him up. Mario, you're just my stature, but you can pick him up somehow. Go do it.
Yeah. The next few steps are about, you know, accruing allies, getting enemies, you know, having the major battle, and then it rounds out by going back home. Sometimes there's a step called the resurrection, you know, which very like Christian like language, I think. You know, I think that's part of like the Jesus's hero journey involves the resurrection and return. But that's the final one, right? So it's return with the elixir is what Volger calls the final step. So basically they come back, they're either celebrated or, you know, they have the key to the city or something major happens and they return home. The townspeople feel safe, blah, 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 blah. Now they're celebrated and eventually they become their own ordinary world afterward, right? Like this is the idea at the end of, you know, fables like happily ever after, right? That's what that is telling you is, and nothing else ever, there was no conflict ever again. This was the ordinary world forever. The world had changed for the better. There's a sense of permanence to it. There's no need to tell another story because this was legitimately the end of anything interesting that ever happened here. But yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking like this would be a cool way for people who hadn't encountered the hero's journey before, perhaps thinking about games through the lens of understanding the similarities across games, and not in a way that is trivializing them, but perhaps even connecting them to other forms of media or like really old stories. Any fables that people are, you know, familiar with, or stories that your grandparents told you growing up, or anything like that, you know, like they're looking at like this kind of central arc that transcends storytelling. I also want to say that there is controversy about this because it's kind of like formulaic, and some people are resistant to the idea that there is just what is called a monomyth, right? That's like what the hero's journey is considered. Yeah. The extremists would say there is only one story, literally, right? Like everything is using this story template.
Right, they abstract everything to the point where it fits that formula.
Yeah, and I think I would like to talk about things that resist monomyth, like, at some point in the future. I think that could be,
Yeah, I was just about to ask you, like, are the people who make this monomyth argument, are they just, like, taking examples and paring them down until it fits this thing, or does it actually fit just that much stuff? And that's absolutely, like, a huge topic that we could jump into that's way too big to jump into right now. Maybe we'll do it as a bonus bite, or who knows, a full episode. Oh, and the one thing I almost forgot to add was, I think a lot of your hero's journey stuff that you mentioned, I got a lot of different, like, Marvel stories out of it, and I'm sure they, like, heavily, you know, pull from that framework, Marvel Cinematic Universe specifically.
Absolutely. Almost to a T.
I think Wisecrack did a video some time ago on it was either Monomyth or, like, Joseph Campbell and how he relates to Marvel, and there was, like, some really cool things about, like, roles like the warrior versus the magician versus the hermit, and what those people became, and how, like, Captain America transitions between different roles, and how Tony Stark transitions between different roles, and to some extent gets to that resurrection point that you were talking about, bringing the elixir back home with the Infinity Gauntlet, and all of that was, like, super cool. So if anyone's listening, I highly recommend checking out Wisecrack's MCU Joseph Campbell video, and definitely checking out Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. I'm somewhat familiar with it because of one of the courses I took in college, but I never gave it a really thorough read. So this was a great bit for me, dude.
Dope. I'm glad you liked it. The only thing I want to say before we wrap up is, I think it was probably the case that the more mainstream the, like, film or television, the more manicured the arc is to be, like, perfectly adherent to the hero's journey, because it's such a riskless, it's almost like generic at this point. You know, for writers who are familiar with the hero's journey, many of them would want to, for the sake of creating new adventurous art, you're trying to manipulate the things in the hero's journey and warp it. You don't want to necessarily abide by the formula, even though you recognize its ubiquity and its importance, and the psychological ways that it affects readers or experiencers of the art. But Disney doesn't want to take risks, right? Like, it's just, it wants something that it knows is going to sell, that they're going to pour all this money into it. They're not going to try to be avant-garde, right? They're going to try to be as mainstream as possible. That is your skill treat. I'm RK Taylor.
Woo!
This is Carlos Gutierrez. And
so tasty skill tree.
We are out. Thank you for listening to Deep in the D-Pad. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and share us with your friends.
For updates and discussion, follow us on Reddit at r/deepinthedpad, Facebook at deepdpad, and subscribe to Deep in the D-Pad on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the bell.
And if you want to ask us questions or you had a chance to share your own D-Pad delight on the show, email us at askdeepinthedpad@gmail.com. Be sure to put question or delight in the subject line.
Big thanks to 8-Bit Jazz and Kevin MacLeod for supplying the music for the show.